I'm going to record, and Dave is good to start the show. We will start the webinar.
Welcome everyone to NEFMA's Coffee Chat featuring Altair. We are so excited to have you here today. My name is Carrie Madnick. I'm the Secretary of NEFMA's Board of Directors. I'm also part of NEFMA's Membership Committee and Coffee Chat Committee. I'm pleased to introduce today's program. Before we begin, I want to review some housekeeping items as the format of our coffee chats has changed to the Zoom webinar platform. We will reserve time at the end of the session for Q&A. Throughout the session, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen at any time to submit your questions to our speakers. If you're calling in by phone, you can raise your hand by dialing *9 and unmute yourself by dialing *6. In NEFMA news, we are thrilled to announce that nominations are now open for our virtual award show. Help us celebrate the best in bank marketing by submitting your 2021 campaign work and have the chance of being featured at our award show on February 17th, 2022. All nominations will be reviewed and judged by an independent panel of judges, and nominations will close promptly on January 7th. We also invite you to review our updated virtual sponsorship packages to help bring your organization to the top of the minds of the best New England bank marketers. Our partners who provide innovative, cutting-edge products, services, and vital information for our bank and credit union members are integral to the success of our events and association. We are also excited to announce that we will be back live and in person for our spring conference on May 12th and 13th at the Graduate in Providence, Rhode Island. Save the date. We will be opening registration and providing additional programming details following the holidays. We encourage everyone to sign up for our e-newsletter on nefma.org to stay up to date on upcoming programming, including additional coffee chats, and follow us on social media via LinkedIn, Twitter, and our new Facebook page. You can find our new Facebook page by searching at New England Financial Marketing Association. We'll be updating our page frequently to provide member spotlights, programming, and networking updates, financial marketing tips, tricks, and more. I am now happy to introduce today's speakers from our premier partner, Altair. Harrison Murphy is the Director of Data Analytics Solutions Specialist for the Americas at Altair. Harry graduated from the United States Military Academy in 2012, where he was commissioned as second lieutenant. After serving 5 years in the field artillery, Harry joined DataWatch in June of 2017 as a solutions architect. During this time, in addition to facilitating sales opportunities, he helped create content for both legacy products and the newer cloud-enabled platforms. After several promotions and DataWatch's acquisition, he now works at his current position at Altair. Stephen Smay is the Director of Data Analytics Solutions Consultants Financial Services. Stephen holds a bachelor's in computer engineering from West Virginia University. and spent over 10 years serving in the US Army. He held many jobs during that time, ranging from operations to logistics to combat engineering to cybersecurity. After a tour in Afghanistan, Stephen turned in his combat boots for a job at DataWatch Corporation as a sales engineer generalist. After several promotions and DataWatch's acquisition, he now works at his current position at Altair. I'll hand it over to you, Stephen and Harry.
Okay, can you see the slides?
Yeah, we should be good, Stephen.
Okay, great. Yeah, so appreciate the introduction there, Carrie. My name's Stephen. This is my voice that you're hearing. I think I might have had my camera on. I don't know if it's on now or not. And then the other guy on the call here is Harry Murphy. And Harry, I think we got you. We got you also.
Yep. Hi, everyone.
Okay. So as the presentation of or as the title of the presentation says, we're talking today about kind of how to find a balance within your organization between finding value and finding some acceptable level of risk. And along with that, let me go in here. We'll go ahead and just start talking about it. We're going to be talking basically about using data and analytics on within your organization and what that means. So kind of the first level of what you're going to see there is just finding out what happened and why. Okay, and as you see on the screen, this is hindsight. It's kind of the beginning of a data analytics journey. After that, we start to get into what will happen, that sort of predictive analytics, and start to be able to maybe derive some insight from your data. And we're talking about things like predictive modeling or doing forecasting, or kind of like trying to figure out what's going to happen as a result of future events or future activities. And again, this is all data-driven insights that we're looking for. And then finally, kind of that high level is that foresight, not just to say what's going to happen, but what should I do in order to influence that, what's going to happen. And there is a jump there from those two things. You think that if you know what's going to happen, that you could know how to influence. There's additional steps that need to go on there. And then, of course, today, we continue to have more and more data available to us. And that kind of just pushes everything up just a bit higher there.
And I think
Harry,
one of
hop in here. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and because I think one of the things you're going to hear us say a lot, or one of the general themes that you'll pick up as we go through this, is going to be the increasing complexity, not only of the challenges from a technology standpoint. For hindsight, it's really easy to shoot a campaign out, have some kind of overall initiative, and then have your goals marked, and then do a bit of that. We call it an AAR, an after action review. What happened afterwards? How successful was it? What happened and why did that happen? That's kind of something that I think is natural for a lot of organizations, and something that people do at a very low level. You don't need a lot of technology in order to do that. It's pretty simple to kind of do a bit of that hindsight. Now, the further up you progress, not only does the technology become a little bit more advanced or complex between the predictive and the prescriptive analytics, it also becomes more complex when we start to bring in different departments. When you have different departments have different needs, they have different challenges, different restrictions, and the more complex we want to make these problems, or the more insight we want to garner from it to get that foresight, to get the eventually to the prescriptive analytics, the more parties have influence in those types of decisions. And we'll get into that in a little bit, where you're not just making these decisions, you're not making these campaigns in a vacuum. You have all these different departments that have a little bit to say about what's going on. So that's one of the biggest challenges. You know, having 3 different bar graphs on a chart here makes it look really simple and straightforward to say, hey, we're just going up and to the right. But it's not only a technology issue. It's not only, you know, do we have the right people? Do we have the right systems in place? Do we even have, you know, the right partners? It's also, do we have the right parties involved in this type of discussion? You know, the more complex, the more insight we want to gain, the more people are going to have influence in that discussion. We'll definitely talk about that a little bit further on. But it definitely starts with this idea of where are you today? And then what are some of those objectives in the short term, and then, you know, your goals for the future. I think we've seen this, and Stephen, you can definitely reiterate if you believe this is true, really everywhere, where it's not you know, it's not enough to do that hindsight piece anymore. You know, as the technology becomes more advanced and it becomes a little bit more accessible to everyone, the expectation for marketers especially is to go up and to the right, to get that insight and get that foresight in order to not have to say, well, why did a campaign fail? What went wrong along the way? To have something a bit more targeted and that you know is going to be successful for the future.
Yeah, and you make a really good point there, Harry, that, you know, this slide, when we look at it here, I mean, it's a straight line up and to the right. In reality, I mean, and obviously this is a visual, it's not, this isn't a data representation here, but in reality, we kind of find it more like an exponential line. Like, it ramps up as you get further out here, and it gets harder and harder to do. If you're sitting, you know, back at the origin here, where you're not, you haven't even gathered the data to be able to do that hindsight yet, it's easy, but there's a big push that you have to take to get to that first level. And then when you get to the next level, it's an even bigger push. And the next level is even more than that. So it's not necessarily a straight line. And part of that is because, like Harry said, you're not working in a vacuum. You have all this data that you're now bringing in from different parts of the organization. And as soon as you start bringing in the data, you start to get the attention as well. You start to get input from other people who are out there, people who have maybe different objectives than you do. You know, everybody has like the same high level strategic objectives, but, you know, there are different ways and different opinions for how people want to achieve that stuff. So that complexity adds in as well, and it's important to bear that in mind, that it's not necessarily just the fact that, you know, doing this type of work, this data science that you see on the right side of the screen, is difficult, that it requires, you know, a good bit of training and education, but that there's that human factor as well, in terms of what's going on in the organization, you know, and what are people's goals and objectives, and, you know, what are the politics behind all of that too. So
yeah, and a big piece here too, especially between the second and the third steps, and of course this isn't, as Stephen mentioned, linear or stepwise. Even it is a gradual change from one to the other. Is a question that we get a lot, is, you know, what's the difference between insight and foresight? If I know what will happen, well, why doesn't that already engage with what I should do about it?
Right.
And I think the big difference here is that piece on the last bar, the decision optimization. And when we talk about optimization, we're talking about balancing needs of multiple different entities inside of the organization. So for instance, in the what will happen, you can say, you know, if we tailor some kind of marketing campaign for customer retention, or to prevent churn, or any of these other objectives that we'll talk about, if we target these specific customers, this will happen. You know, some kind of outcome we can predict with, you know, various levels of likelihood that will be an outcome, and that might be successful for us. But other departments might have a little bit to say about it. You know, that might increase your risk. That might, you know, exponentially increase the amount of fraud, because you're targeting people that will come back to you as an entity, or you'll retain people, but it causes issues for those other types of departments. So that insight, what will happen, well, those things can and will happen, but should you actually do that? Should you actually send that campaign out because you haven't balanced it out with some of the needs, the downsides, the external constraints that you might not have just inside of your own organization. So that, I think that again was going to be one of those themes where, you know, like we love to sit in the what will happen and you know, put on a wizard hat and pretend that we can predict the future. But the what should we do about it is really bringing us back down into the real world to make sure that we're not talking about hypotheticals. We're not talking about stuff that just pertains to us. We're really taking into account all the different parties that have a say in how successful the overall business is as an organization.
Yeah, excellent point. So, and you mentioned a few things in there, Harry, as you were talking. I'm just going to pop to our next slide here, and we can continue to kind of frame the conversation around, you know, what is our overall objective here? You know, we talk about balancing, you know, revenue and risk, or balancing your reward and your risk. This is kind of how we see it breaking down, and the block here on the far left, it says lift right now. What we understand is that we want to take the actions, you want to take the actions of, you know, what's happening at the baseline, and how can we make that better? That's what that lift is talking all about. Yeah, we're talking about marketing lift here. The box originally said revenue in it, but we're kind of working in a bit of a different realm here. So as you can see, we've got several different components here that we're looking to either we want to maximize that or we want to minimize that, and this is all fairly well understandable based on how the slides laid out.
Yeah, and you know, we've kind of heard it broken down to those top three pieces there, that all marketing campaigns and all objectives kind of boil down to those three different pieces. So customer acquisition, just grabbing more people, cross-sell, upsell, getting them more products, expanding that out into our pre-existing customer base, and then the red, flipping it over to reducing that churn. Or I guess if you wanted to look at it in a positive sense, increasing customer loyalty. So that's kind of in the vacuum. All three of those, you know, most campaigns can be broken down into those three pieces, but also understanding that there are those external components that are going to play into that overall lift. You know, the idea that just because we are, you know, acquiring new customers and not really caring about where they come from, hey, we're just hitting our number. We increased our customer acquisition, you know, by 10-20% year to year compared to last year, so we're successful. Whereas someone in risk or fraud can say, well, yeah, but guess what, we also increased our you know, the number of fraud cases that we've encountered over the past year by the same amount. You know, correlation isn't causation, but it can be fairly strong in that regard. So, you know, how successful was that when we look all the way to the left and compared to lift? So this is, again, what we're talking about. The more complex, the more, you know, advanced that we want to start to make some of the analytic decisions that we have as an organization, the wider the scope needs to be in terms of how we measure our success going forward. And I think, you know, one way that we can help provide some of that, or at least give you insight into it, is using kind of an unbiased source in to us, that's statistics. You know, going through this and making a determination on action based off of you know, the science behind the data, which comes down to statistics, is the best way to kind of stand by your actions. So a concrete example of this comes back to that loyalty piece. If we're just looking at hindsight, we're looking at, you know, some of the more rudimentary ways that we're measuring our success. We might have our own ways that we measure those things, you know, based off of how many times a customer is being contacted, the different campaigns that are reaching out to them. We might have an idea of how loyal we expect them to be. Now, when we actually put that through some type of predictive model and we compare the statistics, you know, audience A are people that have left the organization compared to audience B, we've actually done, you know, not necessarily a study, but a use case with one of our customers that found some strange trends inside of them that we probably wouldn't have known to begin with. So in a concrete sense, one of the things that we've seen is that customers who change the way that they're actually managing their account, so between automatic payments, if they switch from automatic payments into actually, you know, turning it off and doing, you know, month-to-month payments, that is an extremely high indicator that they are about to leave. Which makes sense when we talk about it, in practical terms. The first thing you're going to do if you're going to, switch away from a service is make sure you're canceling any of the automatic payments that are going to it. This goes for Netflix, Disney Plus, getting your free trials out of the way. Same idea for this as well. So having the ability to take some of the subjectivity out of it and just look at the data points to say that, a significant amount of the people who left left the company as customers, the first indicator was the fact that they turned off automatic payments. That's now a trigger for us to then send out some kind of campaign, give them some kind of special offer, put them in a bucket and make a decision based off of their actions. That might be something that again, it's the difference between the noise between what the data is actually saying and trying to cut through that noise and find out what things are actually going to be the most predictive and what we should do about it. And again, if they're already customers of ours, it lowers down some of the fraud and the risk because we know that they're either consistent customers. We don't need to worry about the acquisition and their value to the organization.
Yeah, and that is a great example of the when you talk about people who are disabling the automatic payments, not making it so that the checking account at your institution is the one where everything's coming out of. That's actually, like, when you look at it in hindsight and you're like, well, yeah, I could have told you that. Anybody would understand that. It's a very obvious thing. But it's not so obvious until you start to aggregate that data and bring it all together and actually go through the exercise of analyzing it. So you could look at any individual account, you could look at groups of accounts, but this is the type of stuff that comes to light when you're actually working with the data, and that's what's important here. And kind of coming back to the bigger picture of what we see here, we've got these kind of objectives on the top here where we're trying to maximize things like acquisition or cross-sell and upsell. With this type of stuff, it's just important to ask, like, if we have if we write 120% of the loans that we did last year, but of that additional 20%, 90% of them are going into default, is that worth it? So have we actually met our objective? If our objective is literally just a number of how much we're lending, then we could. But we're encouraging a more holistic picture here, and that's why we're including these items on the bottom as well to take into consideration for balancing that value and risk. Okay, and I'm gonna push on here, Harry, unless you have anything else to say here with this.
Nope, we're good.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so we have this kind of acronym that is meant to, again, keep in mind, as you're going through and doing these exercises and looking at the data that you have, looking at what's available to you, putting it all together. This is kind of this is what should be top of mind. Thinking about these fraud, thinking about your marketing communication and maximizing your ROI, thinking about what it actually costs to run that campaign, whether that's the literal physical costs or the cost in time and other resources, and then again, constraining your appetite for risk in terms of, is it worth it to take on particular types of customers, certain customers.
And I think a big point in finding where that balance resides is really from that top-down approach. The overall objectives of your organization, of your bank, of your credit union are going to dictate how much leeway you're giving from one way or the other. The idea that we're trying to if there's been a spike in our appetite for risk, we're willing to make more expansions. That's going to influence our ability to take pointed actions to change the way that our marketing approach is, and allows for honestly a bit of fertile ground to expand the influence of those predictive and those prescriptive modeling techniques, and that's probably something we could talk about here in a bit. But to make sure that the actions that we're taking are nested within inside of the entire organization, and making sure that our left and right limits are still valid is I think one of the more difficult things to actually compete with. When we actually talk about the nuts and bolts of it, the ability to build out predictive and prescriptive analytical models, honestly, that's the easiest part of this entire process. From taking the data from inception, cleaning it up, making sure that we have all the components inside of it, and then doing the proper data analytics tasks on top of it, be it building out a decision tree, which is simply just going to put different values in different buckets, and then translating that into what we call a strategy tree, which is then what courses of action we take depending on which bucket someone's in. All of those things are the easiest part of this entire process. The toughest part is that balancing piece to make sure that we're not putting so much into our actions, that marketing outreach, the maximizing the ROI of inbound and outbound campaigns, that we're being offset by the amount of risk that we're taking because of it. But again, this is all driven from the top down. And I think the biggest piece in all this is to be aware of where it is in terms of that balance. And if that's not being communicated, that makes your jobs pretty difficult to do, because you don't know how far to the left or to the right that you can really take these actions, and what's the appetite for risk, and how much leeway you're going to have in order to experiment with some of these things are actually going to be.
Yeah, and that's a great, again, kind of harping on the fact that we need to make sure that this is an organization-wide effort, that it benefits the goals of the larger organization. It's just funny you mentioned, Harry, that like the actual modeling itself seems like it's the easiest thing. It's true. I went to California. I was visiting a credit union there that's it was in the top 3 of California. I think they've had a merger at this point. This was in 2019, and I was there for a week, and we spent 4.5 days gathering the data that we needed for this model, to try and maximize an outreach campaign. We gathered the data, and we had to go to so many different places in that credit union. We had to know all of these people. And the guy that I was working with, fortunately, he was the one that he had those relationships. So he was able to talk to the people and get that information from them and understand, where does this live? How do I get this? And finally, we bring it all together and kind of manipulate, massage it, get it fixed, join it all together, so that we finally have something that we can use to build that model and to look at and see what's actually happening here and how can we influence it.
And one of the things that, if you were on our last session back in May, which may have well have been, back in the early 2000s, given how long this year has felt in some cases, one of the things that we always like to keep in perspective is that entire data journey and the complexity of each one of these things that we're talking about. So, at the moment, if we're talking about, optimization, this is kind of the, what I might refer to as a capstone type of project. This is the end all be all. If you can get to this portion, you can get to the optimization side of things, you're at that top level of performance. But how do we actually get there? What are those actions that we need to take? And the first thing is identifying where you are on that spectrum between defensive and offensive, and between the complexities of your systems. The thing that we talk about, and the thing that we are always taking for granted, is you'll hear the term, hey, just use your data to make those decisions. Have actionable information that you can make this foresight with. And that sounds like the easiest thing in the world. That's like the base assumption that everyone always makes, just to have your data, it's ready to go. And that's not always the case. So making sure that any pertinent data sets that you have that feed into this type of scenario are going to be valid. Because what we just talked about, or kind of what we alluded to before, is using your data as that impartial observer. And if you're letting the data tell the story, you can't lead it in certain directions. The worst thing that happen is you have your own personal influence actually, influencing the models. You think data is agnostic, but once you start to begin to model it, you can overfit models, you can look for certain patterns where they don't exist. So making sure you have as agnostic data as possible means expanding it beyond the typical silos that you might be using. And that's one of the big pieces that we like to kind of help in, I don't know if you'd want to call it consulting or something, but is actually expanding that the aperture of the traditional data silos that the organizations are using. And a lot of times we find that people are using whatever's the easiest thing that they have available. It's their day-to-day stuff. It's the stuff that's already in, prepared data sets, databases, Excel, historic information. But unless we're comparing that to all of the data that we have available, we're only seeing a small piece of that story. If we're not comparing the digital transactions to on-premise ones, we're seeing a small minority of those pieces. These predictive models, all of the different high speed Watson Analytics commercials that you see, they're only as good as the data that you're feeding in there. So we have a lot of conversations where people want to start here. We want to start at the optimization side of things. And that's a great place to start, is having that as a goal, having that as an objective, but having the honest conversation with yourself to saying, where are we today? How complex do we want to get with these systems? And where are we on that data journey between, hindsight, insight, and foresight?
Yeah, really great point there, especially when it comes to just the tendency for people to want to use what data they think they have available to them right away. I mean, kind of going back to this, this project that I worked on in California a couple years ago. When I showed up, it was like, well, we want to, everything's in the core and on the GL. We should be able to pull it all from there. We should be able to connect to there. That should be able to help us out what we need. Well, come to find out, no, not everything is in the core. Not everything is in the GL. The marketing department there were a couple members there who were not members, but employees who were tracking outbound calls on Excel spreadsheets. And each of them had their own spreadsheet, and each of them had their own color code. And I'm not making this up. They had a color code for whether they made contact with that person, or whether they picked it up, or what they felt like, kind of like what their gut feeling was about these people that they were calling. So that was as crazy as it sounds, like using Excel sheets that you just color the shell, have shaded cells. That was valuable data to us. So we got copies of that, and that was something that we would never have found that by just looking on the GL, just looking in the core, looking on even on the if there's shared files, shared folders or whatever within the credit union. We had to go out and we had to look for it. We had to find that data.
And throughout this, we've been talking about the balancing the objectives and balancing the competing needs of all these different departments, and it has a tendency to always sound like a negative thing, to say, well, why is the fraud department going to start to get their hands in my cookie jar? I'm just trying to send out outbound campaigns. But the other side of the coin is that they have a wealth of information that you may not have had access to from before, or that is going to contribute to these types of things. So if there are any types of surveys from outbound customers, anything from customer service departments, there's a number of different things that are easily accessible in the market, and stuff that we even have inside of our organization that points to, you'll often hear it called NLP, or text analytics, which is natural language processing. The ability to look at someone's language and discern the patterns from that. What are the common themes, the trends, the entities that come up when you interact with these types of customers? And again, what are those types of markers that you can use as a flag for something that is concerning? So in the same way that someone changing the way that they're paying you is a flag that can determine action, or give a little bit of insight as to what's going on in their head, the same way the way that they talk about you, the language that they're using, can also be indicators of that type of future interactions with them as well. So again, it's not only dealing with the constraints, it's also what other data sets are available that might feed into that type of story. And again, one of the things that we're going to talk about here is the how. It's great that we can talk about all of this stuff of, we have to balance the competing nature of the organization, especially when we want to go from hindsight, just seeing what happened, to foresight, what's going to happen and what should we do about it. But it comes down to the how. How do we actually get there? And there's a couple different answers, and it depends on, the bandwidth that you have, the technology that you have available, and your willingness to expand into these different types of conversations. In the past, the bar to entry for some of these conversations that we're having was pretty high. It's you need an entire department full of people in a dark corner, maybe in a server somewhere that you forget about, and they're just grinding away on R and Python on their computer, and all of a sudden a printout comes out with some actions on it, and that barrier to entry is pretty high for a lot of people. Do you have the bandwidth to just add 5 data scientists on your team who are going to be speaking a different language eventually? But what we found is the barriers to entry for each one of these steps, going from just the analytics in the hindsight to the insight into the foresight, there is getting lower and lower as we go forward. The technology is becoming more accessible, but more to the point, it's also becoming more transparent how we're getting there. The most difficult thing to do with this, especially when you talk about optimization, is to come to a conclusion and not have the ability to back it up. If I say, hey, we can have this outbound campaign going to these, 10% of our customers, and we're not going to increase risk, and we're going to have a twofold increase in a certain portfolio or something like that. And they go, cool, prove it. And if I give them a wall of code in R or Python, that's a lot. They're no longer making those decisions. I am, because they're taking me at my word for it, and I need a raise, and I should be at the C-level and give me your job. But now what we have is an approach that allows people to see the transparency in how these decisions are actually being made, to trace from the inception of the data and explain each step along the way. So by the time we get to the conclusion, you're building out kind of a trusted environment to see how these decisions are being made in a graphical manner, rather than just trusting that I've had my 4th cup of coffee in the day and I can code in my sleep, as opposed to, hey, maybe I skipped out on the coffee this morning and I put a 1 where a 0 could have been, and I'm going to tank our campaign for the next year because I didn't anticipate for something. And that goes beyond just competency and capability. It goes in, did I understand the problem set? Did I understand the external constraints? And someone who may not have the technology background can now verify that I understood the assignment, and I understood that what the overall outcome was supposed to be. And that happens through an increase in technology and lowering those bars of entry that would make these conversations significantly more difficult in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's happening kind of all over the industry at this point. We go from the point of having models or data science that you have to have a degree or PhD to understand, to where the models themselves and the tools to create them are becoming more intelligent and actually producing the explanation within themselves. So that is on the horizon, and in some cases it's here to varying levels. So that's definitely something to look forward to. I'm going to go ahead and Oh, go ahead, Harry. Sorry.
Well, I was gonna say, we take that for granted now, Stephen and I, because we talked about building these models out is actually the easiest part. The hardest part is the pieces that you as marketers bring to us, or bring to people like us, or bring to the people building those models, is that industry insight and the overall objectives. Like we've mentioned, starting at the end, this is eventually where we want to get to. And then working your way backwards to say, well, where are we today, and what are those steps that we need to get to? That's some of the more difficult pieces. The nuts and bolts in between has become significantly easier. So at least just having that in your mind and having the willingness to maybe explore some of those conversations is, in my mind, currently one of the toughest barriers to entry is just having the time to maybe get a little creative with your overall outcomes and exploring the avenues that are available in order to get there.
Yes, that's actually an interesting way to put it. That the barrier to entry remains just the willingness to understand that, to take that in. Okay, great. I'm going to advance to the next slide here, and we're going to kind of come back to the idea of balancing these objectives. This slide has some animation on it, so just watch it. It's a little bit, I'm going to admit it's a little corny. Once we have gotten to this point where we know what it is that's what your objectives are, and we understand those holistically, we have the ability to adjust the model to fit your level of risk. Okay, and I'm saying we as in, you know, Altair, but that's you know, that's going to be the case for any organization that you come with. You have the ability to adjust your level for risk. You know, so if you need it lower, you're going to see other things. You're going to see other things go up. If you're willing to accept higher risks, and you'll see, you know, different dials going down and so on. So all of this comes together here when you're working on this type of project, and you're trying to get that settled to where you want to find that balance. We have that ability to kind of dial that in left or right or higher or lower, whichever, you know, whatever visualization analogy you want to use. Yeah, and this is really, you know, just it's important to understand that what's created today doesn't necessarily need to be the final product. It can continue to be evolved. It can continue to be looked at, and that's actually part of the process. You know, it is a cycle to go through and refine your model and refine your goals and refine your treatments and what it is that you're doing, and refine your actions. All of that is part of the learning process. So that's what we want to get out here.
Yeah, and that's a bit of the duality of the ultimate result in this, is that idea that, you know, for other types of technologies and other types of, be it either security or even in our own realm, data preparation, sometimes there's an end state where you say, hey, we did it. You know, we're able to, yeah, we efficiently, you know, optimized the ability to extract data, collaborate, you know, collect it together and you know, synchronize it with a database or something. Like, we did it. That's our end state. We're done for the day. We can just go home. Mission accomplished. For this piece, there really isn't, and you never reach to the point where you're like, man, I built out the perpetual machine model where we just send data in and the perfect result comes in month after month, campaign after campaign, year after year. That never happens, and it can't by its nature, because of all those external constraints are going to change. You know, this year it might be, you know, especially due to COVID and due to, you know, market disruptions and all of that, it significantly changes what that overall strategy for the organization might be. In this case, it's let's reduce the risk as much as we can, which is now going to maybe reduce the amount of those outbound campaigns, and has a direct focus on customer loyalty. Hey, hold what we have, let's reduce risk. But then as the external constraints change, and even the ones internal to the organization as a whole from the different departments, those different factors are going to change as well. And having that flexibility to change those external constraints while maintaining, you know, the content of the model itself is incredibly valuable. One of the things that we talk about and is always a big concern for us is called model drift. You know, we've talked about overfitting a model, having something that effectively we're looking for patterns inside of it, and we're overfitting the decisions based off of the data that we're using. But there's also drift. You know, based off of different things in the market. You know, if automatic payment changes some, you know, there's now a premium that you need to use. You know, to sign up for automatic payment, you now have to pay, you know, $5 a month. Well, people might go, well, I no longer want to do that anymore. So they're going to unsubscribe from automatic payment. So that's that assumption that we've established from before, that if you unsubscribe from automatic payment, you're at risk for churn. The scenario around it, or the conditions on why someone might do that, have changed. So we can't make the same assumption based off of it. And that's what we'd refer to as model drift. The external constraints, the external restrictions placed on our scenario have changed. Therefore, the results that would come out of our model need to change as well. So again, reassessing, re-going through the process of identifying what are those goals, what are the objectives. The entire process is cyclical. And if we wanted to sit down and talk about data science, we'd be talking about the CRISP DM process of making sure we're reevaluating the how successful the performance of our models, to make sure that we don't need to change the output of them. But the great thing about this is once you know, once these things are in place, we simply follow the same steps that we've used in previous sales cycles or marketing cycles, and we pass in through the same types of parameters, and we'll just see different results based off of the kind of the objectives that we're feeding into the machine, as it were.
Yeah, and don't let the crisp DM process or any of the cyclical stuff frighten you, because as Harry said previously, the most important thing is bringing everything together and having it available. So once we've established it, it's easy to adjust it, and that's kind of the point of the slide here, that we have that capability. You see like one item on here is the contact policy. If you say you can only send somebody one email per month, we can code that. That can be coded in. If you only have the capacity to send out a certain number of physical mailings, we can work that in. That can be worked into a model as well. So that and as things change, it's easy to adjust. All of this can be changed. Everything can be adjusted, and it can be set and designed to work exactly as it needs to work for you and your organization and your full objectives.
Yeah, and there's all these things that we didn't even get a chance to talk about, between compliance, legalities, restrictions, externally regulations, all of those different things that aren't even particular to us. Those are all things that feed into the system, and of course, none of this needs to happen in a single session, in a single year, at a single time. It's all foundational. We start at one end of the data spectrum, from that hindsight piece, and we slowly build our way up. And it doesn't become the thing where it's all moot until we get to the end. Each step that we take along the way is going to give us a bit more insight. It's going to make us a little bit more, a little bit more focused in the objectives that we're trying to get to.
Insight is going to give value too. That's the important thing, is that each step along the way, even though it looks lower on our graph at the beginning, that's still valuable to do.
Yeah. There's value at each step along the way. And even again, if this might be a 10-year process to get to the very end of the rainbow. And again, like we've mentioned, you never really get there. It's an escalator in a certain case, but each step along the way gives you a little bit more, it gives you a little bit more confidence in those type of campaigns that you might be sending out, especially when it comes to balancing out kind of those competing needs.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So we're pretty close to being about 10 minutes here. I'm going to push to our final slide here. Just want to talk about the Future Says series that Altair has. If you want to hear more information or you want to get more about it, we've got the website here. We're pulling in people from around the industry and talking about this type of stuff, considerations for artificial intelligence, machine learning, and that sort of topic going forward. So I would encourage everybody to take a look at the site there, and see what content we have available. There's good stuff out there. Harry, did you want to throw anything else out here before we switch to questions?
No, I guess the one thing I will mention too is don't let the terminology turn you off on some of these things.
Right.
The idea between AI and ML. I think whoever had the marketing campaign behind this stuff and turning it into this magical tool that's unattainable unless you're Elon Musk, they did a great job, because it's not as the intimidating. It's not the brain map, the neural networks and all that stuff. Everything that we're talking about today is applies to artificial intelligence and machine learning. Letting the statistics, especially when it comes to data, there's all these different fields of AI and ML. When it comes to data, letting the statistical models of the data sets dictate the trends, the patterns, that is also AI and ML. So it's a catch-all term that's used for everything, sometimes inaccurately.
Yeah, that's thank you for clarifying that. We get carried away sometimes. Okay, well, if anybody has any questions here, we will take those. I believe they're coming via the chat, right? They need to be typed in.
Yes. So first, I just want to say to Harrison and Stephen, thank you so much for joining us today. This session was great and super informative. I know there's some takeaways that I have that I'm excited about. So I did see a question come in to the chat box from Susan. So she says, great job, Stephen and Harry. This is very informative. Question I have is, in my experience, small to mid-sized banks feel that data services are only for big banks. I've heard them say that they are intimidating, even in terms of usage and cost. How would you recommend these smaller banks start this process or delve into data and eventually build upon it?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I'm gonna say, at the risk of pitching ourselves, give us a call. We can have a personal conversation about it, because the first thing you need to do is look at where you are and evaluate where you are. What type of situation are you in right now? What type of data do you have access to? What type of data do you have that you don't realize you have access to? So all of this stuff, we have comprehensive ways to go through and actually look at that, regardless of what size of organization you are. There's always efficiencies that can be gained.
Yeah, and I would always go back to one of the previous sessions that we had, the one back in May, where we talk about kind of the growth going from repeatability to automation to predictive models to artificial intelligence and machine learning. There's either be it linear or an exponential scale. Identifying where you are in terms of that. Each step builds on top of the one that came before it. So, again, if we want to get into the predictive, into the prescriptive side of things, that's great. That's a great goal to have. But being honest with where we are today, it's going to allow you to give a bit of perspective on eventually how we end up getting there. Again, I've had a number of different conversations across multiple different verticals, usually at trade shows or something like that, where we can either give a demo of the product and say, hey, this is great. Where do we sign up? Where do we get started? But doing that audit of what data do we have available? What are significant challenges today in just doing our day-to-day processes that are going to open it up? I think the bandwidth is the biggest issue of where it comes to. It's if it's a small department and you're spending most of the time working inside of Excel, doing manual processes every day, and it just feels like you're treading water. Well, there needs to be a way to make those more efficient or automated to free the department up in order to focus on some of these long-term objectives. It's really difficult to build, a deck on your house if your foundation is crumbling. So, allowing yourself to make the process improvements today in order to focus on those long-term objectives. And again, you'll reap the benefits every step along the way.
Yeah, and we have, I don't know if probably nobody was paying attention when they had my bio at the beginning. I started out at the ground level here when we were still DataWatch. We've been acquired since, but at this point, I'm a director and I'm working at, with all these big accounts and, whoever the largest banks are in the country and stuff. But I started and we still have clients that are right here in New England. There's a credit union up in Lowell that I've visited several times, and this is the same place that comes to my kids' school and gives presentations there. So we have that type of relationship and we have that type of experience to help you get started on your data journey wherever you are and however large or small you may be.
Awesome. And it looks like we have another question that may have just come in. Very helpful presentation. What would be the good approach to find insight or define questions from the data set for a specific project?
So I think starting with the real world question is the biggest piece. That the most simple thing that we ask that is the most difficult thing for some people to answer is we get outbound or we get outreach that says I want to incorporate machine learning, artificial intelligence. I went to a webinar, I went to the Future series, and I'm super fired up to get involved with it. How do I incorporate it? And we go, great, what do you want to predict? And they're like, I don't know, I just want to throw some ML at a wall and see what sticks. So having that just really simplified, as pointed or sometimes even as general as you want to make it is what thing do you want to predict? Is it customer churn? Is it customer behavior? Is it expansion? Is it you know, whatever those real world terms are that you want to tie it into. Yeah, exactly. You know, cross sell, upsell, tying it to one of these concepts, have that defined goal, have that defined outcome that you want to have. And honestly, make it as pointed as you can.
Yeah, and another thing I would suggest is just like that if, you know, look at the top three things here on the right-hand side: acquisition and upsell and churn. Any one of these that you want to see, and even the stuff, you know, on the bottom here with the fraud and the spend and losses, anything that you want to see, we can show it to you. We can actually show you how this works for this specific thing. And we don't have obviously time to get into that in this type of presentation. But that's a good place to start. If you're looking for questions, maybe you want to know questions that we've answered elsewhere before. So that's always a good place to start, I think.
Start there and then work your way backwards to say, what data do we have that's going to contribute to this story? And again, that may not necessarily even be up for you to determine, to say, hey, you know, this is a good data set, this is a bad data set, this data set is worthless. You know, again, let the statistics tell that story. So for instance, a little bit of an aside is that, you know, during COVID, we're still going through it, but we were doing a prediction on admittance into hospitals. And we were using a data set that was over 500,000 rows long. Yeah, just over 500,000 rows of data, but also 960 columns, different variables. It was pertaining to each individual patient, as it were. So every little minute thing you could think of were in there. You know, have they ever broken an arm? You know, do they have a sprained ankle? You know, what do they have for breakfast? You know, all of these different things, because we don't know which ones are going to be important to that overall story. We have what we call a dependent variable. This is the thing that we're trying to predict. Everything else is going to be an evaluation as to how well it does at predicting that type of variable. So if you have that end goal that you want to get to, we want to predict customer acquisition, we want to predict retention, we want to predict all these different things. You know, consolidating as much of that data as you can, the more data you can throw at these problems, the cleaner and the easier that insight will be. And again, you don't need to make that determination. You can let the statistics, you can let the programs do that for you.
All right, attendees, this is your final call to get your questions in. We have Harry and Stephen on the phone for another 3 minutes. So we'll give you a few more seconds to get your questions in, and then we'll close this out. All right, well, Harry and Stephen, thank you for joining us today. Again, this was a great session. And attendees, we hope to see you at the upcoming awards show and NEFMA conference in 2022. So thank you everybody for joining today.
Thanks everyone.
Yes, and thanks for having us.